The personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world to tell businesses things that they need to know now. It was hard for me sleeping last night because I was so excited to have Jeff Jockisch on my show. He is the head of Privacy Plan, and also Jeff puts together this fantastic curated list of data privacy podcasts. So I think you and I were communicating with each other or commenting on each other's posts on LinkedIn, probably even before you started that or you started putting that out. But your list has gained so much traction because I don't think anyone is curating privacy podcasts in the way that you're doing. And it's very important, I think, because as you know, when you look at podcast directory, they're very general. So being able to have someone like you who could sort of go through and curate that list and do it in such a detailed manner, it's amazing. Just look at your database and how you track this stuff is unbelievable. So yeah, I would love for you to say a bit about yourself. I don't know. We may have to do a couple of these things because I have so many things I want to ask you. So we'll try to keep it down to 30 or 40 minutes, but I'm not sure.
Well, it's good to be here, Debbie. I appreciate the invitation. Yeah, I've been doing these data privacy podcast lists for a little while now. It's actually relatively new. I started tracking podcasts actually when I was studying for my CIPP-US over the summer, but I really was just doing it for myself. I had a relatively small list, maybe 10 or 15 different podcasts that I was listening to, sort of tracking for my own purposes. But sometime, I think it was in November, might have even been closer to December, somebody on the IAPP listserv asked about, what podcast people were listening to about privacy. And so I said, well, maybe I ought to post my list. And, I had this small data set, so I posted it. And it sort of grew and grew and grew from there. And I do think we were probably interacting before that, but that's when we sort of started interacting a whole lot more. The podcast list has really turned into something that's, I guess, gotten me some attention from the privacy community, and I've really sort of loved turning it into a real pet project, if not more than that, because it's grown pretty massive now. It's actually got, I think, 75 different podcasts now that I'm tracking, and there's a whole lot of data. I actually added a whole new tab to the data set now that tracks actual individual episodes. And I'm actually considering doing a project where we not only get sort of like the titles of the episodes and the little synopses, but actually going back and trying to get some podcasters to get transcripts from those podcasts and do some natural language processing of the text in the podcasts to sort of like see how privacy professionals talk about the world and compare that to how normal people talk, which is, I think, sort of interesting. There's some studies that I've done in the past, sort of comparing the way different people talk in different professional ways about language sets, and you can find some really compelling things by doing those kinds of analyses.
Oh, that's fascinating. I love that. I'm actually a fan of linguistics or psycholinguistics. That's one of my little secrets. So that would be fascinating. Your list is the list. So there is no other list besides this list as far as I'm concerned, because you do such a great job. And I've just been in awe with the detail that your list goes into. It's fascinating. And I agree, you've listened to a lot of these podcasts. I like what you just said because people do talk about it differently. For me, because I am very steeped in technology and I understand the law, I always try to sort of bridge that gap between the two. Because, as I can tell, you're a data person like me. So, so to me, the patterns of data really fascinate me. One thing I will say is that a lot of times when I'm editing, the text or transcripts for the podcast, it's funny because some of the editing softwares, they don't really comprehend people well enough when they're talking about big issues. So when you're talking about the world, they're thinking about what's down the street. So the scope of what they're thinking about is different. So I know when I'm talking with people like you who sort of understand big concepts and you can make it simple, I know that I have to do some extra looking at the editing, because a lot of times they're assuming that things are more, I don't know, provincial. I don't for a lack of a better word.
Sure.
But one thing I will say, I want to say about you and your commentary, I'm always excited. I try to tag you on stuff that I think you'd be really interested in. And you always come back with an elevated commentary. So elevated in a way that you're sort of bringing the conversation up, but doing it in a way where it's still relatable. So that is a great skill to have, and you do it really well. I feel like sometimes you're like a hot butter knife through butter, and you can really go, you really slice into these concepts, and you just have, such brilliant commentary.
Well, I think maybe you recognize that because that's what you do a lot of, Debbie. But I appreciate the comment. I think maybe I got a little bit too much into the weeds of what I do with what I want to do with my podcast list, but I don't know if all your listeners realize that, what I really try to do with that podcast list is, I started out as really, it was just a list, right? And then I started adding more, information about each of the podcasts. So, who are the podcasters? What are the companies that sponsor them? And then I started saying, okay, well, how can we sort of categorize each of these? So I took each of the podcasts and said, well, how uniquely focused on data privacy are they? What other focus do they have? Do they focus on cybersecurity? Do they focus on risk? Do they focus on data governance? Do they focus on policy? And I actually created a whole, set of tags and taxonomy to sort of try to describe them, so that you can, if you're interested, go and sort of search on those terms to find, if you're interested in a particular, if your particular interest is in, policy, you can find the podcasts that focus more on those kinds of things. Or if you're interested in something else, you can find those. And I've actually put a page up on my website now where you can actually search even easier than doing it through the data set. But then if you've got those kinds of taxonomies put in place, then you can actually start putting in additional things where you can actually rank and rate them, right? And when I started rating podcasts, that actually got more people's attention, right? Because they're like, oh, well, okay, now we can actually see who's, maybe higher ranked than everybody else. And so that was something I think I didn't really expect was going to be all that popular, but it was, right? And then, of course, the other thing that I try to do is I try to tell people, what am I actually listening to? So once a week, I'll do my sort of top 3, which is getting harder and harder when you're listening to so many, but picking out a couple of the sort of best episodes of the week is pretty great for me. And it helps me sort of promote people in the industry.
Well, I've been very proud that you featured me a couple times on your list. I've been so shocked because I was like, oh my God, what have I done? So it's nice to know. For me, I'm doing the podcast because I love having one-on-one conversations with people. And I'm just naturally inquisitive and interested in this topic. So it's not hard for me to come up with questions. I probably have more questions than we have time, definitely. But, that type of recognition really has been very helpful. And it helps me know that, I'm talking in ways that people really appreciate, which, sometimes you don't get that feedback, right, from podcasts.
Well, absolutely. And it's sort of come to my attention that most podcasters really get very little feedback. It's sort of, I mean, maybe you understand how many people are following you, right? And maybe, if you're getting ad revenue, which most privacy podcasts don't get, right? You get that number, but you're getting very little listener feedback unless they happen to rank you on Apple Podcasts. And that happens very rarely, right? So what
Right.
feedback are you really getting? Very little. It's hard.
Yeah. You're doing a great service to the industry. Well, let's get into what we wanted to talk about. I obviously, this is hard for me because I have so many questions I want to ask you. But one thing that we chatted about was talking about data brokers. And I think data brokers is a topic that doesn't get covered a lot, and you know quite a lot about it. So I'd love to dive in and get your thought about data broker, who they are, what they do, and what is kind of the challenge with data brokers.
Sure. So my company, Privacy Plan, is a small company, and what I've really started to do is change its focus to really be on privacy data sets that are focused on the privacy world. And over the summer, in addition to sort of focusing on building some data sets on podcasters, right? What I was really focused on was building a data set of data brokers. And I sort of started this data set by looking at the Vermont data set, because brokers have to register in Vermont. And there's also a data set in California, because there's a California data broker law. And there's also the privacy rights website. I'm forgetting exactly what the name of that is, but there's a nonprofit organization that tracks data brokers, but their data set's pretty old now. So I took all that information, essentially scraped it, put it into a big data set, and I think I ended up with about 600 different data brokers. And then I sort of expanded that information by going to a data broker and paying for information about data brokers from a data broker, right? And then I said, well, this isn't enough. There's, lots of data brokers that aren't in here. So I started building that out by hand, by adding in ad tech companies, by adding in social media companies, and using a variety of different tactics to build out that info set, both vertically and horizontally. And at this point in time, I've got about 1,400 plus data brokers listed in my data set, and I've got about 180 plus fields of information on each one of them. Of course, not every single one. I've got 180, but it's pretty deep, and that sort of spans a variety of different types of information. So I've got just basic information about them, so I know who the company is, what their descriptors are, different keyword tags about the different companies, where they're located, phone numbers, email addresses, things like that, right? But more importantly, I have information about sort of like what industries they're in, so we can sort of, figure out that. And then I've got classifications, right, which are very unique to the stuff that I do. So back in 2014, the FTC did a big study in data brokers where they really said that sort of data brokers are sort of an intrinsic harm, right? But then they never really followed up and did anything about it. But part of that study sort of put brokers into 3 different buckets. And those buckets were sort of people search engines, marketers, and risk assessors. I think I've got that pretty close to how they described it. I've sort of taken that taxonomy and expanded it a little bit further. So the way I sort of group these data brokers is in 4 different buckets. People search, screeners, right, which is essentially risk assessors, but a little bit more broadly. And then targeters, which is all kinds of different ad marketers, right? And then monetizers, because there's not a group that really covers the type of companies that collect information but don't sell it. Rather, they monetize it by keeping it inside. This is primarily large social media companies and other organizations. There probably should be a fifth bucket, and that is data collectors, people that collect massive amounts of information but don't yet monetize that data. The problem is that if you were to do that, you'd potentially, have every company in the world, listed in your data broker list. But, we have this problem in the United States where there's really no laws other than maybe CCPA where there's purpose limitation, right? So they can collect all this information, and tomorrow, unless the CCPA steps up or the FTC gets involved, they can take your data and use it however the heck they want. There are some limitations to that, obviously, but there's not a whole lot. And so, it's sort of a scary world out there. So anyway, that's the way I've sort of organized these companies. And then there's lots of different pieces of information where I've gathered on how, what information they sort of collect on you, and how, what sort of different markets they target, and what sort of information services they provide. Are they collecting location data? Are they collecting this kind of data? Are they, doing, are they targeting human resources people? Are they targeting this kind of market? It's pretty extensive. And then probably the most important thing that you would be interested in is I've also cross-referenced all of these data brokers against privacy problems, for a better word, right? So I've cross-referenced it all against data breaches. I've cross-referenced it against FTC consent orders. I've cross-referenced it against big name privacy lawsuits. I've cross-referenced it against law enforcement ties. And I've even gone so far as to develop, at this point, a relatively crude metric to try to figure out how good or poor they are at being an advocate with people's data, right? Actually using the wrong word there, it's escaping me at the moment, but trying to give them an indicator, using an indice to figure out how good or bad they are at keeping the public's trust with their data. At some point, I'm going to put together sort of a top 10 list or a top 100 list on how well they're using the public's trust or abusing it.
That's fascinating. I would love to see that. And again, you're doing a service that we definitely need because very few people know anything about data brokers or the information that they're capturing. What people don't know is that there are essentially data dossiers floating out there about individuals. And actually, I've seen some pretty extensive categorization lists of people. So, suburban dad who drives a pickup truck that has 2 kids in college.
Right.
So it's very, the way that they sort of target people is very precise, I would say. And then 2, you have brokers that are collecting different information, but they're combining data sets together. So they may be joining forces to pull more information. So let's say, for instance, you gave a company information about you for one purpose, and then you give another piece of information to a different company for a different purpose. That data may end up in maybe 2 different data brokers' hands, and they may combine that information together where maybe it was fine the way that you gave it to them, but now they sort of kind of have skirted the rules by pulling that information together.
Right. And that's really what's happening, right? There are the largest data brokers out there have aggregated all of that information, right? I'm not necessarily sort of pointing to any particular company. I'm going to throw this name out, but I'm not sort of saying that they're any better or worse than anybody else. But Axiom claims to have 11,000 data points on virtually every consumer, right? 11,000, right? I mean, that's probably every single data point that could exist on you, right? I mean, maybe there's more, but that's a hell of a lot, right?
Was a lot of data, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's correct either. So then 2, I think the thing that concerns me, and I tell people about this a lot, is if you don't have information, if you're not, for people who are not putting out or having any control over sort of their name, right, in the marketplace, what they're doing, those gaps get filled in by other people, and it may not be correct either. So
Right.
being able to sort of put out sort of who you are and what you're about definitely helps. But I think people who don't do any management at all, their sort of digital identity, they sort of run the risk of having someone make up stuff about them that may harm them in the future.
Yeah, and and it's not just that, right? I mean, I think that the accuracy problems that these companies have, particularly the screeners, are getting more problematic because there's more and more data, right? The data glut that's happening out there is actually making the accuracy problem a lot worse, regardless of whether you're trying to control your information or not. I've seen a few studies. I can't quote any specifically at the moment, but that essentially show that there's a lot of inaccurate data out there. I can tell you that, well, this is a little bit tangential, but of all the data brokers that I've got in my data set, 59 of them have actually been breached. So that's a heck of a lot. I mean, if regular companies get breached, that's one thing, but a data broker getting breached is even worse, right? But the other problem with screeners, right, who are screening you for employment, who are screening you for loans, who are screening you for apartment, if you're trying to get an apartment, is that it's better for them to be able to exclude you and say, oh no, this guy might be a bad risk, right, than to allow you to go through and then then you turn out to be a problem, right? So if your name's Bob Smith and there's some other Bob Smith who's got a problem, right? It's better for them to err on the side of caution than to err on the side of, oh no, that was the wrong Bob Smith.
Right.
So they don't have a whole lot of incentive to fix that problem.
Right. And because of the way that the data brokers work, they don't necessarily have to tell you how they got the data. Right.
Well, I think, if they're abiding by FACRA, right, they have to tell you that they're taking an adverse action on you based upon your credit rating or credit score, right? But that doesn't always happen if they're using alternative data sources, right?
Right. Yeah. That's very frightening. Yeah, that's true. Right. Because companies really want to reduce their risk. And so if these companies are saying, this person is riskier than this next person, you may get denied something and not even know sort of why, maybe instead of just saying you had adverse action, like especially in employment, they can use some of the information that they can use, they could possibly exclude you before you ever enter their system, right? So your resume could go into the trash based on what they can find out beforehand, and you would never know.
Right. And that definitely happens, right? I mean, there's been some studies that show that just based upon your name sounding foreign, you may not even, make it to the recruiter, yeah, right? Or whatever. I forget the exact circumstance, but there's definitely some proof that that's happening.
So what do you think is happening with the data broker industry, especially as it relates to regulation? So obviously things like the GDPR and in the EU, they are very strict on purpose of data. And then we're seeing with the CCPA in California, where they're trying to pin down people sending data to third parties and making sure that they let them know sort of about that. And I think that's going to be the trend. But purpose, to me, is the big problem with a lot of this data collection, because some of this data collection is done indiscriminately and it doesn't really have a purpose at first, probably. And then down the line, maybe they'll make one. So I think it's a danger, and maybe I'm wrong about this. You tell me what you think. So if laws are going in the way where they're saying before you collect the data, you have to have a purpose for it, that is a danger, I think, to data brokers, because they're just they're vacuuming up data and then hoping to find a purpose for it as opposed to having a purpose to begin with.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely right. I mean, the CCPA, they threw in a purpose limitation amendment. No, it wasn't an amendment. I guess just a little clip right at the end, right before it passed. And Attorney General has made a clarifying statement on that, but it actually sort of weakened it a bit based upon whether the change in the purpose is material or not. But then the problem there with that law is there's no private right of action anyway, right? So it's got to be enforced by the by the well, with the new CPRA, it's got to be enforced by that agency. But I didn't actually see whether or not the CPRA made any change to that purpose limitation. I don't think it did, but I could be wrong there.
I don't think it did. But that's really an important point, and that's sort of a gap in sort of our laws about purpose. And I hope that we can shore that up in the future, because I think purpose is very important. Collecting, and a lot of my European friends, they feel this, intrinsically in terms of their fundamental human right about just having too much data. You'd be surprised what inferences people make based on data that may not be correct. It's because they just collect too much stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, this is fascinating. So I'm hoping, so with the Vermont law, I like what you're doing. So when the Vermont law came out, the data broker law, I thought it was a good step. But the problem that I had with that is because people don't know who these data brokers are or what they do, like that list is not very helpful. I think me as an individual, if I went on that site, I looked like it would just be, hieroglyphics probably. Because I'm like, so what does this mean to me? I don't understand, right? So how can people find a way to understand what data brokers are doing or find out how their data is being used, or can we?
I don't think it really helps a whole lot, right? I mean, it's a good first step, but I mean, Debbie, here's the problem, right? I mean, if I gave you a list of 1,400 data brokers, what are you going to do? Are you going to email all of them and tell them to stop, using your data or selling it or to delete it? I mean, first of all, you got to find their portal, and then you got to, each of them have a whole separate process on how you got to make that request, and then you've got to make sure that they actually follow it, and it's a problem. Consumer Reports just did sort of an expose. I've got a friend who's actually been doing some research on it, and it's really not very effective process right now. In fact, there are some third parties that have been trying to help people do that, right? Where you could sort of go to them and, as a third party service, they would try to do all that stuff for you. It's just not really working very well. In part, I think those third party services aren't very good yet, but we're still sort of in this notice and consent, framework, and it's just not going to work if that's what we're up against, right? When there's so many of them, and they're just going to keep growing.
Very true.
And they've all got a different process, right? There's another piece of this that we probably ought to mention, right? And that is that I told you that there's all kinds of different types of data brokers, right? One thing we didn't discuss is what the heck is the definition of a data broker, right? I mean, legally. If you look on Wikipedia, the definition of a data broker is anybody that sort of collects public and private data and sort of aggregates it. That's sort of a synopsis of what it says, right? But if you go to the Vermont law and the California law, it sort of puts a lot of limits on that, right? So the law says that you're only a data broker if you sell the data, right? And of course, some of the other pieces of legislation make it a little bit different, but there's all of these sort of like caveats and opt-outs, right? That I'm not even sure some of these companies that are data brokers even realize that they're technically a data broker, right? So whether they're registering or not may not be that, maybe because they don't even know that they're technically a data broker.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, we need to find some way to be able to make this more visible to people in terms of how their data is being handled. Because, I try to follow these things pretty closely, and I am even confused. So
Yeah, right.
for the average person, they just have no shot, no chance whatsoever to be able to sort of even comprehend what's happening with their information. One thing that we talked about, something that you bring up in commentary that I see, which I actually adore and I want to talk about, and it is privacy as a human right versus a property right. I would love for you to sort of talk about that and talk about your idea about this, and maybe I'll chime in and let you know what I think.
Sure. So, I think it probably needs some more flesh. My ideas need some more flesh, but in essence, it's sort of this, right? That I think that privacy needs to be a human right. In Europe, they sort of passed, a law way back. Probably going to get the wrong time frame, but I think back in
1950s,
40s or 50s, saying that the privacy was a human right. But in the United States, we've never really recognized that. California has, the right of privacy in their constitution, but we've never really sort of called it a human right. We've always sort of approached it as more of a transactional right or a property right. And as long as we're in that modality where I could sort of sell my property right for money or trade it for access to a social media app or, do something like that, then I think we're sort of in the wrong mode. And there are lots of people that sort of want to get into this data economy where, maybe I can make money off of my identity and my data, right? By, trading it. So instead of having Facebook make money off of my data, I'll make the money off of my data. And that sounds pretty good when you sort of think about it initially. And in fact, even parts of that actually are good, right? Because if you're talking about your intellectual property, right, about your posts and your content, I actually think that is pretty good, right? I mean, if you're creating content on YouTube, you ought to be getting part of that revenue from the ads that show up on your content, right? But when you back that up, when you're talking about your actual identity, right, it's a different proposition, right? What you don't want is people selling their organs for money, right? You don't want people selling their identity so that they can pay for a meal, right? Because what that does is that means that it's only the marginalized communities and the people that have no other recourse that are going to be giving up their identity when everybody else, the rich folks, right, don't have to give up their identity. You make sort of a dual class citizenship over identity. And that's a really bad proposition.
It is. It's terrible. I feel like they're just anyway in the digital age, there is a caste system being created. So it's the haves and the have-nots, but the haves are the people who have data and have insights, and the people who don't aren't going to get ahead, right? But I agree with you wholeheartedly about, privacy as a human right versus versus a property right, because not every human is a consumer. So in our system, those rights kick in terms of an exchange of some sort. So in my view, that right, you should just have it, right?
Yeah.
So that you don't necessarily have to trade it. So my thing is, in the US, do we have a right if we don't want to share our information? And really the answer is no, because the way that it's articulated in our system, there has to be an exchange of some sort. So the fact that you don't want to give your data isn't really protected in the way that we want it to be, because it assumes that there has to be a transaction in a way. So for me, that's the reason why privacy should be a fundamental human right, because I need to be able to have the right to not share my information.
Right. I mean, if you look at, what is the FTC going to enforce, or what is the state attorney general going to enforce if they're going to enforce a privacy problem? It's unfair trade practices, right?
Right.
That's what Section 5 is for the FTC, and the unfair and deceptive trade practices are on the state level. That's mostly where all the privacy enforcement comes from. It's a contract, right?
Right.
Being broken. So you're right on target there. And this brings up another point that we've discussed, right, which is the whole concept of data fiduciary, right?
Right.
When you give your money to a CPA or somebody else who's, a bank, right, they have a fiduciary responsibility to take care of that money for you. If you
Right.
think about, data as being similar to money, right? When you give your data to a company, shouldn't they have that same fiduciary responsibility for your data?
Right.
There are some people that actually think that maybe they already have that responsibility. It's just not being enforced.
Mm-hmm.
Or perhaps we need to pass legislation to make that more clear to them, right? But that would be an interesting way to get us privacy rights, maybe instead of or in addition to a national privacy legislation.
I always ask people this question, Jeff, if it was the world according to you and people do whatever you said, what would be your wish for privacy regulation, either in the US or around the world?
That's a good question. I think what I would probably change is how we deal with de-identified data. We've had a few discussions around that, I think. To sort of nutshell it, I don't think that people understand the risk of de-identified data. And this sort of goes back to the data brokers, right? Not just them, but other companies too. We think when we de-identify data, we're making it safe. And it's just so easy to re-identify de-identified data that it's not safe, right?
No.
You can get re-identify data so easily in so many cases that it's just scary.
Yeah, I love that you said that. Actually, I really like when I ask people this question, I don't think I've had two people that ever say the same thing. So this is great. But I agree with you. And back to your point about the data brokers and them having so many thousands of data points on people, the legal requirements or the legal measures that are written into laws about how you de-identify data are not sufficient because there are so many data points that can be used to re-identify a person. So I read in an article many years ago that it really only takes 3 pieces of information to identify someone.
Yeah.
And I can attest to you that this is true because this happened to me recently where someone was saying, they were trying to tell me about some person and they were like, he has a red beard, he's a lawyer and a technologist. I'm like, I know exactly who that is.
Right. There's a couple other quick data points or quick pieces of information we could share with people too, right? So if you take 4 spatiotemporal data points, right? Time location stamps, right? You can identify a unique person 95% of the time.
Oh, wow.
Yep, right. And some Euro researchers back in 2019 said that if you take any random 15 demographic features, you can identify virtually any person in the world uniquely.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. We need to catch up. We need to have the regulation catch up to the fact that it's so easy to identify people. And I think it's going to become even easier. Not just because of the data collected, but because the computing is becoming more advanced, so they can do these things much easier. So I know a lot of people, I'm obviously concerned about facial recognition, but there are so many other data points that people can identify you that don't need your face. Like your pattern of life is something that identifies you,
Yeah, absolutely.
So, wow. Well, I have to have you back because we have lots and lots of stuff to talk about, I see.
Sounds wonderful.
Well, why don't you tell me how people can contact you and how they can access I would love for them to know how to access your data broker stuff and your podcast list and just your company in general.
Well, sure. You can contact me at jeff@privacyplan.net. And actually all of the information, including the data broker and the podcast database, are right on my website at privacyplan.net.
That's amazing. Well, thank you so much. I am going to write a note to myself. We should talk probably in a couple months to see if anything different has happened, or we can do a deep dive into some of this other stuff because I think it's fascinating.
Sounds wonderful. Great talking to you.
Thank you so much, Jeff.